Hey guys, tonight we drift back into the crisp, unforgiving air of 18th century Iceland. You stand where the jagged lava meets the sea and the wind greets you like a slap that instantly clears any thought of a warm bed. The salty spray clings to your lips, mingling with the smoke of peat fires curling from turf-roofed houses. This is not a land of lush vineyards or olive groves. It's a place where survival hinges on fish, sheep, and arguments about both. You probably won't survive this if you were suddenly dropped here with your modern appetite for pizza or bubble tea. But the locals, bundled in wool and armed with patience, know exactly how to endure. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in right now, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing just how far this little sleepy history community stretches across the globe. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the rocky shore, your boots crunching over black pebbles polished by centuries of tides. The sea smells like fish multiplied by 100, because on wooden racks stretched above you, thousands of cod are hanging, stiff as planks, drying in the sharp northern wind. The locals call it hard fesker, and they gnaw it the way you might chew beef jerky. Except this jerky could survive a Viking raid, 3 storms, and a storage closet for decades. It's food, yes, but also a kind of edible insurance policy. If you've ever felt guilty about letting lettuce wilt in the fridge after 3 days, here you learn that nothing is wasted. Beyond the beach, the settlement is small, a cluster of turf houses crouching low to avoid the winds. Each one is like a hobbit home if hobbits were perpetually cold and had to make do with sod instead of ornate round doors. Inside, the warmth is thick with the scent of fish oil, wool, and the faint tang of smoke from seaweed fires. That smoke clings to everything: clothes, food, even your hair. It is, for better or worse, the signature perfume of the island. As you watch, a fisherman in rough wool hauls his catch ashore, the cod glistening like polished stone. The fish are so central to life here that Icelanders half-jokingly treat cod as both currency and conversation starter. "Nice weather we're having," translates to "the catch was good today." If you thought talking about the weather was dull, imagine how dull it gets when every conversation is about dried fish yields. Perfect bedtime material. Historians still argue whether Iceland's early coastal economy should be described as proto-capitalist or simply subsistence-based with occasional bursts of trade. What isn't debated is how fragile it all was. One bad fishing season, and winter stretched out like a grim joke that no one wanted to hear. That's why you see families huddled over racks, checking the fish constantly, guarding them from birds, and muttering complaints about neighbors who let gulls snatch too many pieces. Yes, even back then, gossip about bad housekeeping could ruin reputations. You glance inland, where sheep dot the mossy slopes, their wool like little tufts of cloud against the dark rock. Already you sense the tension. Sheep mean survival, but they also mean endless arguments about grazing rights. For now, though, it's the fish that rule the day. Fishermen mend their nets with fingers so calloused you imagine they could slice cheese without a knife. Children scamper about collecting driftwood because every twig matters when trees are practically extinct. You think about how we complain when Wi-Fi drops for 10 minutes, and here people worry about whether they'll have enough sticks to boil water. In the harbor, a small boat returns with barrels from abroad. The excitement is palpable because foreign ships mean salt, maybe spices, perhaps even fabric dyed in colors brighter than moss green or mud brown. Salt is especially precious. Without it, preserving fish properly is a losing battle. You realize how absurdly lucky you are to sprinkle sea salt on fries without a second thought. Here, that same pinch could determine whether your family survives winter. A quirky tidbit catches your eye. On the racks beside cod, you see shark meat. Except it's not just hanging, it's buried in the sand under stones, fermenting away. That infamous hackerel. Locals claim it's edible once the ammonia drains out. You sniff the air and nearly gag, wondering if this is a prank passed down through generations. It's like the island itself dared its people to eat the one thing that smelled like cleaning products. Yet they did, and still do, partly because survival left no room for squeamishness. As dusk deepens, you step back and notice how quiet everything feels. There's no hum of traffic, no neon signs, no podcast buzzing in your ear, just wind, gulls, and the faint slosh of waves. The monotony is heavy but strangely comforting. People here live by a rhythm older than time. Fish by day, dry it by night. Repeat until the seasons change. It's boring, yes, but in that boredom lies security, and in security, the chance to argue about sheep tomorrow. You duck through the low doorway and step into a turf house pantry where the smell of the sea has moved in and never pays rent. On one wall, wooden tubs and barrels. On another, racks of fish that look as if they've been ironed flat by the wind. A woman in layered wool lifts a lid, and a sour, milky aroma rises like a ghost. Way, the leftover from making skyer? She uses it the way your kitchen uses a refrigerator, as a cold, tangy bath that keeps food from turning on you. You watch her lower a clutch of pale fish into that liquid. There's no generous shower of salt here. Salt is a visiting celebrity who shows up late, leaves early, and charges extra for appearances. You quickly learn the math of scarcity. Iceland has no rock salt, sunshine is rationed, and fuel is too precious to waste on evaporating seawater into neat crystals. If you try to boil a pot of brine all day, someone will ask if you're also boiling the family's winter. Driftwood isn't exactly prime shippable. Peat is needed for warmth, and the wind handles most preservation for free, so fish are dried hard as shingles. When salt does arrive, it arrives by favor of other people's ships. In the 1700s, that means the Danish trade monopoly decides who gets what and when. That's your mainstream fact for the night. For centuries, Denmark controlled Iceland's official imports, and salt sat behind that velvet rope, nodding coolly while commoners petitioned the doorman with wool. Historians still argue whether this monopoly sensibly stabilized a fragile economy or throttled innovation like a too-tight scarf. Because salt is scarce, ingenuity becomes the house spice. You study the barrels again. Some hold seawater brine that's been hoarded like treasure for months. Some hold whey, tart, pleasantly acidic, a natural preservative. That whey pickling surmature is the island's quiet genius. Fish, lamb tidbits, even odd scraps find their way into those lactic pools where bacteria do the careful work of making dinner safe. It's chemistry that your tongue translates as sour but alive, and your stomach translates as will live another week. If you've ever marinated anything in yogurt, you're already halfway to this technique. Just subtract the recipe blog essay and add relentless wind. You step outside as a fisherman salts a few select cod with near religious focus. These are not for tonight. These are investment fillets because a properly salted fish can travel and be traded for things like tools, cloth, or, if you're lucky, coffee, which tastes like rebellion in a cup. But look closer. He salts only as much as the household can spare. The rest will dry in the wind or dangle in a smoky loft until flavor and functional shake hands. A quirky tidbit. The smoke itself may come as much from dried sheep dung as from wood, lending a faint barnyard perfume to your dinner that no candle can disguise. On the bright side, it's impossible to oversmoke. The wind simply refuses. Inside again, you peek into another tub and discover a clouded brine infused with seaweed. Dulse, syöle, is torn into ribbons and tucked alongside fish to add minerally bite. Think of it as a coastal oregano that grew up on a steady diet of waves. You taste a strand. It's ocean salty, iron rich, and somehow comforting, like someone put a tide pool in a spice jar. You're starting to get why Icelanders didn't panic about pepper. They had an entire shoreline of substitute sparkle at their feet. And if they wanted a lemony lift, there was Arctic thyme and angelica, herbs that hid under turf, then arrived at the table like shy divas with big voices. There's a rhythm to all this. Drying when the weather allows. Whey pickling when cheese is made. Salting when ships cooperate. At the hearth, an old man, eyes bright as frost, tells you that his father used to concentrate brine by leaving pans in the icy air. Water would freeze first, salt would linger as stronger brine beneath. Was it efficient? Well, define efficient when your workers are time and winter. Historians still argue whether households truly relied on such micro-hacks at scale, or whether these were occasional experiments that lived more in memory than inventories. Still, the story warms the room more cheaply than peat. You follow a bucket to a small spring house where cool water whispers over stone. Someone has stashed sealed containers there, trusting running coal to slow spoilage. Beside them, a sack of kelp ash, dark, fragile flakes that crumble like a burnt map, gets sprinkled into certain stews for a saline nudge. It's not table salt, but it tricks your tongue into thinking the ocean is sitting at the table, elbows out, telling long stories. Joke number 1. You realize you've spent 12 minutes in this section thinking about salt like it has a personality, which is a sure sign. Bedtime is working. A catechism of constraints guides every hand in the kitchen. No waste. No blazing fires unless necessary. No careless handfuls of anything. You find a small logbook, really a few stitched pages, tracking how many measures of brine were used on which fish and whose sheep contributed milk for the skyer that produced the whey that saved the fish that fed the people who argued about the sheep. If you can diagram that sentence, you're officially part of the household. Joke number 2. Somewhere, a modern productivity app just blacked out from envy. At the table, you sample thin slices of rastour fish, gently fermented rather than salted, matured by air and bacteria into something that whispers instead of shouts. The flavor is assertive like a handshake from someone who doesn't know their own grip, but it's also clean, free of rot. People here can calibrate the line between matured and monstrous with a skill that would make a cheesemonger bow. Historians still argue whether this taste world emerged primarily from necessity or from acquired preference that became cultural pride. The locals shrug. If it keeps you standing, it counts as good. Outside, you pass a storage pit lined with stones and sealed with turf. Nature's pantry? A family lifts a lid, and the earth exhales cool, damp air. Inside are sealed jars of fish that took short baths in brine when salt was momentarily available, then were tucked away. The jars look unimpressed with your curiosity, as if they know they'll be the heroes in February. Joke number 3. One of the children names a jar King Codward III, and honestly you salute. Before sleep sweeps the village, a rumor skims the shore. A merchant ship was seen beyond the headland. If true, tomorrow might bring salt, pepper, or even cloves, those fragrant little nails that make fish feel dressed for church. But you've learned not to plan on luxuries. You plan on cleverness, on whey, on wind and smoke and seaweed. When night folds over the turf roofs, the pantry still hums with quiet chemistry, paddles resting against barrels, lids set back on their seats like hats. The island doesn't give much, but it rewards attention, to tides, to temperatures, to the exact moment when sour becomes safe and safe becomes supper. And you, blinking in the low lamplight, realize that in this kitchen, scarcity hasn't made flavor impossible. It's made flavor ingenious. You wake with the weak light of an Icelandic morning, slipping through turf roof gaps, a pale beam that feels less like sunshine and more like the lantern of a neighbor checking to see if you're still alive. You pull on your wool cloak and follow a woman into the fields just beyond the village. The ground is a quilt of moss, stone, and stubborn green patches, but look closer. Tucked low against the earth are herbs that seem almost too delicate for this climate. She bends, parts the moss, and there it is. Arctic thyme. A tiny purple bloom smelling faintly of lemon and earth, fighting wind the way you fight Monday mornings. She hands you a sprig, and when you crush it between your fingers, a faint aroma sparks awake. This, you're told, is seasoning enough to rescue even the most uninspired dried fish. You imagine your own spice rack at home, a chaotic carnival of jars, and laugh at how each one here is treated like a family heirloom. Mainstream historical fact: Arctic thyme and angelica were two of the most relied upon flavorings in 18th century Icelandic cooking. Angelica, with its celery-like stalks and slightly bitter bite, was so valued that it was sometimes given as tithe to the church, proof that even priests wanted their fish to taste less like pure despair. A quirky tidbit? Angelica wasn't just food, it was considered a medicinal powerhouse, believed to chase away plague, scurvy, and probably bad moods. Some households chewed its stalks raw, crunching away like 1700 snack bars. You picture a group of kids swapping angelica stalks in the way modern children swap candy, and the humor writes itself. Joke number 1. Want to trade my celery on steroid stick for your dried fish scrap? Possibly the least exciting barter in history. You continue your walk, kneeling to pluck crowberries, tiny, dark fruits growing on wiry shrubs. They taste sharp, tart, like someone forgot to add sugar. But they lend color to stews and provide precious vitamins in a land where citrus is as mythical as unicorns. Women gather these berries carefully, storing them in whey or as preserves. You pop one into your mouth, wincing at the sourness but grateful. It's basically Iceland's version of a Sour Patch Kid, minus the cheerful packaging. Along the path, you pass low stone walls shielding herb plots from the wind. Families sometimes transplanted wild angelica closer to home, treating it as both spice and remedy. The leaves dried for winter, the seeds saved for tea, the stalks candied with honey if honey was around. And it usually wasn't. Bees don't exactly thrive in gale force winds. Historians still argue whether angelica's prominence in diet was due more to its health properties, or simply because it was one of the few green things that didn't give up. Either way, when you drop a chopped stalk into your fish stew tonight, it will feel like a victory garden in miniature. You watch as another villager picks seal, red seaweed, from rocks along the tide. You'd seen it before, crumbling into stews like herbal confetti, but now you realize it isn't just filler. Chewed raw, it's chewy, salty, with a whisper of iodine, like licking an oyster shell. Combined with Arctic thyme or angelica, it rounds out a surprisingly layered flavor profile. If your definition of layered includes a solid wall of ocean. Joke number 2. Iceland's MasterChef edition would probably involve 10 contestants arguing about who added too much seaweed garnish. Inside the turf house, the herbs reappear in clever ways. A pot of lamb stew simmers, its broth faintly scented with thyme and dulse. Over in a corner, a woman is steeping herbs into hot water, making what she insists is both a tea and a cure for wind in the stomach. You take a sip, grassy, earthy, surprisingly calming, and pretend you don't notice the strong aftertaste of peat smoke. This is Iceland's multi-tool approach. If it seasons food, it probably also cures a cough, and if it grows under moss, it probably ends up in your dinner sooner or later. A story is told by the hearth. How, in lean times, people chewed on dried angelica roots to keep hunger at bay. Roots that bitter, you suspect, were less about nourishment and more about distracting the stomach with sheer unpleasantness. Joke number 3, basically the 18th century version of chewing gum that fights you back. The afternoon brings another revelation. You trail behind a shepherd carrying a pouch of herbs, which he scatters into milk to flavor soft cheese. You taste a piece, and the faint bitterness makes you appreciate how even sheep cheese can be coaxed towards something resembling complexity. You wonder aloud if anyone ever dreamed of pepper or cinnamon here. The shepherd laughs. Those are luxuries for trade ships. But thyme, angelica, seaweed, berries, those are free if you know where to look, and if the wind doesn't blow your harvest into the next fjord. As the day cools, villagers sit together, passing dried fish with butter, sprinkled lightly with herbs. The thyme cuts the monotony. The angelica sharpens the taste. The seaweed reminds you again that everything here loops back to the ocean. Historians still argue whether this humble herbal use should be considered seasoning in the European culinary sense, or whether Iceland was simply engaged in survival with accidental style. Either way, as you chew, the flavors feel less like desperation and more like stubborn pride. Night falls and the herb bundles hang from rafters, drying in the smoky air. They'll be stored carefully, rationed over months, parceled out in pinches. You lean back, watching the flicker of lamplight, realizing that in a place where salt is gold and pepper is fantasy, a sprig of thyme or a stalk of angelica can feel like treasure. And treasure, when it grows in your own rocky field, carries a taste richer than any imported spice. You sit near the shoreline again, and the breeze carries something sharper than fish and peat. It's an odor that doesn't politely linger in the air. It smacks you, curls your nose hairs, and dares you to keep breathing. A man with weathered hands beckons you over to a pit in the ground, covered with heavy stones. He lifts one, and there it is. Hakarl, the infamous fermented shark, lurking in its sandy crypt like a prank gone horribly right, or horribly wrong, depending on your stomach. The process, he explains, is simple in theory and traumatic in practice. Fresh Greenland shark is poisonous if eaten as is, thanks to its overload of urea and trimethylamine oxide. The solution? Bury the flesh in gravelly pits and weigh it down with stones so the toxins seep out. After weeks or months of this underground spa treatment, the shark is dug up, cut into strips, and hung to dry for more months in the open air. By the time it's ready, the flesh is white. The smell is ammonia, and the taste, well, you'll find out. Mainstream historical fact. This method was not invented for culinary thrills, but sheer survival. No salt, no refrigeration, no alternative protein source big enough to rival shark. People ate what the sea gave, and if it required a burial and a rebirth, so be it. Quirky tidbit. Visitors in the 18th century sometimes wrote letters describing the shark as inedible, except by Icelanders and their dogs. You imagine the dogs negotiating, tails low, muttering, "Do we have to?" The locals, however, consumed it with pride, even ritual. Small cubes served at gatherings, often washed down with brennivine, that fiery schnapps distilled from potatoes and flavored with caraway. Without the schnapps, you wonder how anyone made it through more than one bite. Joke number 1. Hakarl may be the only dish in the world that actively judges you while you eat it. Its smell arrives before you do. You pinch a cube between two fingers. The villager grins, clearly amused at your hesitation. You bring it to your lips, chew, and suddenly the room feels like it has been scrubbed with industrial cleaner. Your eyes water. Your throat tries to politely refuse. You swallow anyway, and the villagers nod approvingly as though you've passed an exam. The truth is, this isn't about flavor. It's about toughness, about proving you can handle what the island demands. Historians still argue whether hakarl was consumed regularly by most households or whether it was more of a ceremonial oddity trotted out during feasts and tests of bravery. The written records show both pride and disgust, but the persistence of the dish suggests it was more than a novelty. In a land where variety was as rare as summer heat, even a shark with a bite like bleach was welcome. You walk inland later that day, and the memory of the shark's taste refuses to leave your mouth. Someone hands you a piece of dried cod as an antidote, and you realize the comparison. Cod is the bread and butter, while hakarl is the daredevil cousin who shows up at family reunions to remind everyone they still have a pulse. Joke number 2. Iceland's culinary slogan could have been, "Mostly edible, occasionally a dare." In the evening, you join a group in a turf house for a midwinter gathering. The food on the table is humble. Dried fish, butter, curds, but in the center, a plate of shark cubes sits like a centerpiece. Children giggle at guests' reactions. Old men swap stories of who chewed bravely and who nearly fainted. It's food as entertainment, proof that even in bleak times people wanted something to laugh about. And yes, sometimes laughter came at the expense of the guest who gagged. The villagers retell an old tale. A man once claimed he could eat a whole shark leg without flinching. He made it halfway before bolting out the door, collapsing in the snow, declaring the air smelled sweeter than heaven. The punchline? He still tried again the next year, joke number 3. Stubbornness was Iceland's unofficial spice blend. You think about how food in other countries often served as status. Banquets, fine wines, imported delicacies. Here the delicacy was a necessity disguised as a dare. To eat hakarl was to say, I belong here, I endure. And that endurance was seasoning enough, proof that flavor sometimes lies not in pleasure but in perseverance. As night deepens, the shark hangs in the breeze, strips swaying like ghostly banners of survival. The smell seeps into your wool, into your hair, into your dreams. You understand finally why Icelanders could laugh about it. When your land tests you daily, sometimes the only victory left is biting back. You follow a narrow path that climbs away from the salt, stiff shore and into rolling, moss-covered hills where woolly shapes graze. At first, they look like stones scattered across the slope, but then one bleats and the whole hillside comes alive. Sheep. Dozens, maybe hundreds, their wool puffed like cloud fragments that somehow forgot to drift into the sky. Here in 18th century Iceland, sheep are not just livestock. They are the economy, the pantry, the wardrobe, and the family drama rolled into one. You watch a shepherd boy count them, his lips moving slowly. 1, 2, 3. Then he stops, squints suspiciously at the next cluster. Did he already count that one? The sheep blink back, equally suspicious. This is not trivial. The difference between 47 and 48 sheep could mean surviving the winter or begging your neighbor for scraps. Mainstream historical fact. In 18th century Iceland, sheep were the backbone of subsistence. Their wool provided warmth. Their milk turned into skyr and cheese. Their meat offered rare variety, and even their dung became precious fuel. Historians still argue whether Iceland's pastoral system was more cooperative or more conflict-ridden, because the sagas are filled with tales of neighborly fights over grazing rights. A quirky tidbit surfaces. In some places, villagers practiced communal herding, where flocks were driven into mountain pastures each summer, watched over by hired shepherds. When autumn came, they returned for redder, the roundup. It was equal parts agricultural necessity and community festival, with singing, feasting, and plenty of arguing over which sheep belonged to which family. Picture a massive lost and found, except everything is bleeding and covered in wool. Joke number 1. Imagine retrieving your jacket at a party, but it keeps trying to run away while someone else insists it's theirs. This is where arguments flare. You lean on a turf wall and overhear 2 men debating ownership of a particularly plump ewe. They've both marked her ear with notches, and the overlap has created confusion. One insists his mark came first, the other swears he added his notch years ago. Voices rise, hands wave, and you realize Icelandic patience wears thin when sheep are on the line. There were legal structures for this, local assemblies called thing meetings, but in practice, tempers and memories decided just as often. You trail after the flock and notice the land itself doesn't make things easier. Grazing is patchy, the soil thin, the moss delicate. Too many sheep in one spot, and the earth erodes quickly, leaving black sand and stone. Farmers knew this, yet the pressure to increase flocks was strong. Families wanted wool to trade, meat to salt or dry, and milk to stretch meals. Overgrazing became an early form of ecological stress, a slow-motion argument between human need and natural limit. Historians still argue whether the damage visible today in Iceland's landscapes, bare hills, drifting sand plains, was largely caused by medieval and early modern sheep herding, or by volcanic activity and harsh climate alone. Either way, the sheep get plenty of blame. Later in the afternoon, you join a family in their low-roofed byre. Sheep shuffle inside, the air warm with lanolin and manure. The farmer's wife gently milks one, the stream filling a wooden pail. She explains how the milk becomes skyr, that thick, tangy staple you've tasted before. Without sheep, the diet would collapse into nothing but fish and prayers. Joke number 2. Skyr might be Iceland's greatest magic trick, turning milk into something halfway between yogurt and cheese, and then convincing every generation afterward that it's trendy again. Evenings often brought the biggest quarrels. Over a simple meal of dried fish dipped in butter, neighbors gathered to talk. Soon the talk turned sharp. Who let their sheep wander too far? Who borrowed, grazing without asking? Who failed to repair boundary walls? These disputes could simmer for years, punctuated by sudden flare-ups when a sheep strayed and someone's patience snapped. A villager tells you of an infamous case where a disagreement escalated to blows, then to court, and finally into a generational feud. You nod, realizing this might explain why the sagas always read like legal thrillers with livestock cameos. Yet, despite all the tension, sheep also stitched the community together. During shearing season, families gathered to clip wool by hand, laughing, singing, gossiping. The fleece piled high, destined for yarn that would become lopapesa-style sweaters long before tourists considered them iconic. Joke number 3. Every Icelandic grandmother, then and now, probably had at least one unfinished sweater stuffed in a corner, waiting for winter boredom to finish it. As the day ends, the hills quiet. The sheep huddle close, their breath steaming in the chill air. You look at them differently now. Not just animals, but currency, conflict, companionship. They are the measure of wealth, the source of warmth, the spark of arguments that echo through valleys. You stretch your arms, wool-scented and weary, knowing that tomorrow someone will count again, squint again, and argue again. In Iceland, the sheep are never silent, even when they're not bleeding. You settle onto a low wooden bench inside a turf house where the evening meal is being laid out. At first glance, it looks like the culinary version of déjà vu. More fish, more dairy, more repetition than your streaming algorithm recommending the same song 3 times in a row. But here in 18th century Iceland, this pairing of dried fish and dairy isn't just dinner. It's the entire nutritional strategy of a people who had to wrestle with scarcity as a daily sparring partner. On the table lies a board of hard fisker, the dried cod you've already seen, stiff as planks on the outdoor racks. But now the hard shards are softened, not by cooking, but by generous smears of butter. You watch a boy tear off a strip with his teeth, dunk it into the butter dish like chips into salsa, and chew until it dissolves into salty, chewy sustenance. Mainstream historical fact. Dried cod paired with butter was the foundational meal of 18th century Iceland. Fish provided protein, butter supplied fat, and together they filled bellies when variety was a rumor and fresh produce a fantasy. A quirky tidbit, some households preferred to dip their dried fish into sour milk instead, creating a tangy, chewy combination that modern taste buds might call acquired. You try it, and it's like pairing beef jerky with yogurt. Surprisingly edible, slightly confusing, and definitely designed by someone whose primary concern was staying upright through the next blizzard. Joke number 1. If you ever complain about bland office lunches, remember that Icelanders in 1750 were excited when someone said, "Tonight we're changing it up. We're dipping in milk instead of butter." The balance between fish and dairy was practical, almost mathematical. Fish was abundant, preserved easily by drying, and lasted for months. Dairy from cows and sheep had to be consumed fresh or turned into butter, skyr, or whey. Together they offered a mix of macronutrients that kept people alive through winters when the land seemed determined to starve them. Historians still argue whether Icelanders consciously engineered this balance for health, or whether it simply emerged from what was available. Some even suggest that the near monopoly on fish exports forced locals to rely more heavily on dairy for fat, shaping the domestic diet by default rather than design. You dip another strip of fish into butter and realize how the richness transforms the otherwise dry, fibrous texture. Without fat, the cod would be like chewing parchment. With it, there's a sense of indulgence, however modest. This explains why butter itself was guarded like treasure, often stored in sealed barrels buried in the ground. Rancid butter known as sursmjör wasn't thrown away. It was eaten with enthusiasm. The tang was considered flavor, not failure. Joke number 2. Imagine bringing rancid butter to a potluck today and proudly announcing it's aged to perfection. At the hearth, a pot of skyr sits cooling. Thick, tangy, somewhere between yogurt and cheese, it is eaten with wooden spoons or stirred into milk to stretch it further. You try a mouthful, and its tartness cuts through the salty fish taste, like a culinary palate cleanser designed by a farmer with 3 ingredients to his name. Children giggle as they lick skyr straight from bowls, while elders sprinkle dried herbs or berries on top, turning monotony into a small treat. You notice the ritual around meals. No rushing, no novelty, just steady chewing, conversation, and a sense of resignation softened by humor. A villager jokes that a man once dreamed of a feast with roasted meats and sweet cakes, only to wake up with a strip of fish stuck to his cheek. Joke number 3, culinary daydreams in Iceland were basically fantasy novels with butter as the main plot twist. Despite the monotony, the fish-dairy duo offered security. If one supply faltered, the other could help. A poor fishing season meant relying heavily on dairy, while a bad grazing year meant leaning on fish until the herds recovered. You sense the rhythm of this interdependence. 2 food groups carrying the island on their shoulders like weary but reliable oxen. Historians still argue whether this heavy dependence on animal products contributed to later health problems, or whether the hardy metabolism of Icelanders adapted over generations. What is certain is that the diet built resilience. Bones were strong, bodies endured, and spirits managed to stay just light enough to make jokes about sour butter. As the fire dies down, you scrape the last of the butter from a wooden dish. The lamp's glow flickering over faces weary but content. Outside, the wind moans across the lava fields, but inside, you are warmed by fat, protein, and the steady company of people who know survival doesn't need variety. It needs balance. You lean back, your belly full of fish and dairy, and realize that in this land, simplicity is not a flaw. It is the recipe. The next morning, you wander down to the rocky shore again, where the air thrums with the voices of men and women trading loudly over barrels. A little inlet serves as a market, though it looks nothing like the bustling ports of Amsterdam or London. Here it's rough-hewn wooden stalls, fish spread out on planks, wool folded in heaps, and the occasional barrel that smells faintly of brine and hope. It's trading day, and everyone has come to argue about price, swap news, and silently judge each other's knitting skills. You watch as a fisherman hoists a barrel of herring, the salty liquid sloshing out, darkening the stones. Salt herring is high-status currency, almost luxury because it requires imported salt and the right catch. Wool socks, on the other hand, are practically minted coins. Everyone has them, everyone needs them, and everyone insists theirs are sturdier than anyone else's. Mainstream historical fact, coastal markets like these were part of Iceland's local economy, but larger trade was dominated by the Danish crown, which maintained a monopoly over imports and exports through licensed merchants. That meant foreign spices, fabrics, and salt trickled in like stubborn rain, never quite enough for demand. Historians still argue whether this monopoly crippled Icelandic growth or preserved stability in a fragile island economy. At one stall, a woman proudly displays hand-knit mittens, patterned in simple stripes. She wants dried cod in exchange. The man across from her shakes his head, claiming his fish is worth far more than 2 mittens. She glares, insisting she used her best wool. He shrugs, pointing to a younger woman selling socks with finer stitching. Already you sense this could become one of those feuds that everyone remembers 3 winters from now. Joke number 1. Iceland's version of Black Friday was probably 2 neighbors wrestling over who got the last pair of mittens. Nearby, a group of young men argue over the weight of a barrel. Did it contain the promised number of fish, or was it topped with seawater to make it seem fuller? Someone pries it open, and sure enough, a guilty amount of liquid sloshes out. Tempers flare, voices rise, And you wonder how many markets have ended with one neighbor giving another the cold shoulder for the next decade. You remember the sagas, half history, half soap opera, and realize that market squabbles must have supplied plenty of material. Quirky tidbit: wool products weren't just traded locally, they were Iceland's lifeline to the outside world. Homespun cloth, called vadmals, was so standard it functioned as currency. Farmers carefully measured cloth lengths, and disputes over whether a strip was woven too loosely could make or break a deal. You picture someone trying to pay for coffee today with a bolt of fabric, and the barista checking weave density before serving your latte. Joke number 2. Sorry, sir, this weave is substandard. No cappuccino for you. In one corner of the market, you hear talk of ships in the harbor, Danish merchants unloading barrels of salt, rye flour, and maybe, if luck has a sense of humor, coffee. Imported goods carry a thrill: peppercorns, sugar, even a splash of wine. They're doled out sparingly, tiny luxuries that brighten otherwise monotonous meals. Families might save a pinch of cloves for a wedding cake or a Christmas loaf, stretching that fragrance across generations of stories. The air buzzes with barter: fish for wool, butter for cloth, sheep hides for iron nails. Every trade seems wrapped in a layer of argument because trust is thin and resources thinner. You see two farmers leaning in close, whispering over the exchange of a ewe. Both glance around nervously because grazing rights and flock numbers are always under scrutiny. Sheep, fish, wool, butter. The lines blur, but everything flows toward survival. Children run underfoot, chasing each other with scraps of dried fish, while their mothers scold them not to waste food. Someone sets up a pot of hot broth, and people gather to sip while continuing their debates. There's laughter too. Stories of storms survived, of boats nearly overturned, of a goat that wandered into the churchyard during service. Humor oils the gears of trade, reminding everyone that no matter how heated the argument, they'll still need to live side by side when the snow comes. As the market winds down, you notice how nothing here feels casual. Every sock, every fish, every pinch of salt is tied to effort, to survival, to long nights of work. The villagers pack up, shoulders heavy with goods and unspoken grudges. You realize that markets in Iceland were less about abundance and more about distribution, ensuring each family scraped together what they needed before winter tightened its grip. Historians still argue whether these local markets reflected communal cooperation or simmering rivalry, but you've seen enough today to suspect the answer is both. Cooperation to keep the island alive, rivalry to keep everyone awake. Joke number 3. In the end, the loudest currency wasn't wool or fish. It was the gossip traded freely between stalls, priceless and impossible to counterfeit. You leave the market with the echo of voices behind you, the taste of salted herring still on your tongue, and the sense that every trade, no matter how small, carried the weight of Iceland's survival. The wind curls down from the hills, carrying with it the scent of earth and smoke. Tonight you find yourself seated by a hearth, staring into a pot where herbs float lazily, releasing steam that smells halfway between soup and pharmacy. A woman stirs, then pours the liquid into wooden cups. "For the stomach," she says, handing you one. You sip. It tastes like grass, pepper, and something faintly bitter, but soothing. This is no accident. In 18th century Iceland, the line between food and medicine was thinner than the thread spun from sheep wool. Mainstream historical fact: many herbs, angelica, arctic thyme, dandelion, were prized as much for healing as for seasoning. Angelica especially was considered a cure-all, good for digestion, good for plague, though no one could prove it, and good for driving away evil spirits. Monasteries in earlier centuries had even cultivated it deliberately. Historians still argue whether its dominance in diet was medical necessity, cultural symbolism, or simply practical availability. Whatever the truth, a stalk of angelica could end up in your stew or your poultice, depending on whether you had a cough or just a bland fish dinner. A quirky tidbit: some families made leifjagros bundles, collections of dried herbs tied together and hung from rafters. They'd steep them in milk or whey for both flavor and remedy. A sore throat, thyme tea, a sour stomach, angelica broth. Trouble sleeping? A handful of moss boiled into a bitter nightcap. You glance at the steaming cup in your hands and wonder if this is supposed to help you sleep or keep you awake. Joke number 1. In Iceland, your dinner and your medicine cabinet probably looked suspiciously identical. You watch as another villager crushes dried seaweed into a paste, mixing it with butter. For wounds, she explains, but then slathers a bit on bread and eats it. Seaweed worked both ways, bandage and condiment. It's practical, if not appetizing. Nearby, a man sneezes and his wife immediately thrusts a cup of thyme infusion into his hands before he can even finish exhaling. You can almost hear him sigh. Here we go again. In the dim light, an old man tells you that whey wasn't only for preserving fish. It doubled as medicine, drunk to cleanse the body. You taste some, sharp and sour, and your tongue instantly regrets it. He nods approvingly, as though your grimace proves it's working. Joke number 2. Nothing builds faith in a remedy like watching someone else suffer through it first. Even the act of fermenting shark or fish was occasionally framed as medicinal. Strong, sour, stinky foods were thought to strengthen the constitution, to toughen the stomach. You recall gagging on Hakarl and realize maybe your stomach was already tough enough. Still, the philosophy lingered. If it didn't kill you, maybe it cured you. The villagers' conversation drifts to stories of midwives who brewed herbal drinks for childbirth, of shepherds who chewed angelica leaves on lonely hillsides to stay awake, of fishermen who carried thyme sprigs as charms against seasickness. Food, medicine, and superstition were all folded into one. Historians still argue whether Icelanders genuinely believed in the mystical power of herbs, or simply layered superstition onto practical knowledge to make bitter medicine easier to swallow. Children sit by the fire chewing dried berries like candy, their lips stained dark. Their mothers remind them not to eat too many or they'll get hot stomachs, a vague warning that sounds like either indigestion or a metaphorical curse. You smile, recognizing that every culture invents parental scare tactics. Joke number 3. Don't chew too much thyme or your ears will ring all night. Probably nonsense, but effective enough to keep kids from raiding the herb stores. Later, you step outside into the cold air. The stars are fierce pinpricks in the sky, and from the houses you hear coughing, laughter, the clink of wooden cups. Somewhere, someone is sipping an infusion and convincing themselves it tastes fine. You realize that in a world with no pharmacies, every meal doubled as a kind of medical experiment. Flavor, health, survival, they weren't separate categories. They were all stirred together in the same smoky pot. You breathe in deeply. The air smells of fish racks, seaweed, and faint thyme drifting from chimneys. It feels medicinal just to stand here, which might be the greatest trick of all. Convincing yourself that the land itself is a tonic, even when it mostly tastes of smoke and salt. You wake to the sound of laughter drifting over the fields. It is midsummer, and though the air is still crisp, there is a lightness that lingers well past midnight. Families gather in the grassy commons, children darting between turf houses with wreaths of flowers on their heads. Tables are set outside, but when you peek at the platters, you notice something familiar. Dried fish again, and butter again. Even in celebration, the menu refuses to dress up too much. Still, there's an excitement in the air that makes the repetition feel almost festive. Mainstream historical fact: midsummer festivals and other seasonal gatherings were crucial for 18th century Icelanders. They weren't just excuses for feasting. They served as social glue, where marriages were arranged, disputes were settled, and news spread across valleys. Food was central, even if central often meant salted lamb bones and hardfisker. Historians still argue whether these gatherings leaned more toward religious observance, with Christian rites woven in, or whether they preserved older pagan echoes under the hymns and prayers. Either way, they offered moments when scarcity was briefly overshadowed by togetherness. At one table, a family proudly lays out a wheel of cheese they've been saving for weeks. It's small, crumbly, but treated like a crown jewel. Everyone gets a slice, thin as a coin, but savored slowly. A quirky tidbit. Some households saved up butter in underground pits just so they could unearth it for a wedding feast, where rancid, tangy flavors were considered a delicacy. Imagine unwrapping a wedding cake today that had been fermenting underground for 2 years. Joke number 1. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something that buried butter. Music fills the air, fiddles, simple flutes, and voices rising together. Children chase each other with sticks pretending to be swords while adults dance in measured circles. You bite into a piece of dried cod dipped in butter, and for once the monotony feels different. Surrounded by laughter and song, the fish doesn't taste like obligation. It tastes like belonging. Nearby, a storyteller begins weaving tales of heroes and ghosts, sagas of old kings and cursed farms. Everyone leans closer, mouths busy chewing fish and skyr. You notice how the feast isn't about indulgence. It's about stretching the ordinary into something worth remembering. A barrel of ale is rolled out, weak, homebrewed, but strong enough to make cheeks flush and arguments about sheep briefly disappear. Joke number 2. The only thing faster than emptying a barrel of ale at an Icelandic feast was starting a rumor about who was courting whom. As dusk blurs into midnight sun, a lamb stew is ladled into bowls, rich with whatever greens could be coaxed from the stubborn soil. It's thin by modern standards, but hearty enough to draw sighs of satisfaction. For dessert, a few preserved berries are offered, their tartness cutting through the heaviness of fish and dairy. The children squeal as though they've been handed chocolate fountains. You realize that in a land of scarcity, sweetness is always a small miracle. Historians still argue whether these seasonal feasts were moments of genuine abundance or carefully staged delusions of plenty. Perhaps both. The food might not have been extravagant, but the social richness, songs, stories, laughter, created its own fullness. You watch a group of neighbors who were bickering last week now sitting shoulder to shoulder, tearing fish strips and passing butter, as though generosity could erase grudges, at least for one night. Later, a bonfire is lit and sparks race into the sky. Young men leap over the flames in daring displays while elders clap and shake their heads at the recklessness. The fire smells of peat and dung fuel, smoky but cheerful. Around it, couples whisper, children doze on laps, and someone passes around another cup of ale. Joke number 3. The only hangover worse than Icelandic ale might be realizing you have to eat dried fish again for breakfast. When the gathering finally winds down, the tables are bare except for fish bones and empty butter dishes. People drift back to their turf houses, voices soft but content. You walk slowly through the grass, the midnight sun still glowing faintly on the horizon. The feast wasn't about what was eaten, really. It was about reminding everyone that even in a land of scarcity, there could still be abundance in company, in song, in stubborn joy. The day drifts into a haze of gull cries and damp wind, and you notice something peculiar in the kitchen. A jar is opened, and instead of butter, fish, or whey, the contents shimmer with an amber gleam. It pours thick, almost syrupy, and the smell is unmistakable: cod liver oil. Tonight, you realize that Iceland in the 18th century didn't just eat fish, it wore it, drank it, and practically baptized itself in it. Mainstream historical fact: cod liver oil was a staple in Icelandic households, valued both as a nutrient and as a general cure-all. Rich in vitamin D, though no one called it that back then, it helped compensate for the sunless winters. Historians still argue whether its widespread use emerged primarily from practical medical wisdom, or simply from the sheer overabundance of cod livers that had to go somewhere. Either way, generations were raised on the habit of swallowing spoonfuls of the stuff daily. You sit at the table and a wooden spoon hovers before your lips, heavy with gleaming oil. You hesitate. Everyone watches, waiting for the foreigner to gag. You take it in, and instantly your mouth is coated with liquid fish. Your throat rebels, your stomach quivers, and yet somehow you manage to swallow. The room erupts in approving laughter, as though you've been knighted by cod. Joke number 1. In Iceland, the true test of adulthood wasn't your first kiss. It was keeping down your first spoonful of cod liver oil. But the oil wasn't only swallowed. A woman dips her fingers into a jar and rubs it across her child's cheeks to prevent chapping from the wind. Later, she smears some on a piece of bread, treating it as a spread. You glance at the bread, wondering if hunger can ever make fish oil toast seem appealing. Apparently, yes, when you live in a place where calories mean life. A quirky tidbit. Cod liver oil was sometimes stored in sheep stomachs or bladders, tied off and hung like grotesque balloons in the rafters. They swayed in the smoky air until tapped for family use. Imagine bumping your head on one of those in the dark. You shudder, suddenly more awake than you intended. Joke number 2. Nothing says sweet dreams quite like a cod oil piñata above your bed. As you walk outside, you see its other use. A fisherman rubs oil onto wooden tools and even into leather boots, waterproofing them against the sea spray. The oil becomes not just nourishment but utility, gluing the domestic economy together in ways butter never could. It is food, medicine, polish, and weatherproofing, all distilled from the same fish that dominates every meal. Later, you sit with an old man who insists cod liver oil sharpens the mind. He recounts how, as a boy, he had to drink a whole ladle of it every week before heading to church. Keeps you awake through the sermon, he says with a twinkle. You're not sure whether it kept him awake or simply kept him distracted by the taste. Joke number 3. The only thing stronger than faith in Iceland was the aftertaste of cod oil clinging to your tongue. At supper, the oil reappears in subtle ways. A drizzle is stirred into broth, giving it richness and sheen. A spoonful is rubbed into candle wicks to help them burn longer. Someone even mentions rubbing it on sore joints. The versatility borders on absurd, but then again, when the sea offers abundance, you don't say no. You just find new excuses to use it. Historians still argue whether cod liver oil should be seen as a cultural cornerstone of survival, or as an accidental byproduct of necessity. Some records suggest it was exported in modest amounts, traded for foreign goods, though not in the industrial scale that would come later. For most Icelanders, it stayed close to home, inside bodies, on tools, under fingernails. As the night deepens, you realize the smell of cod oil hangs everywhere, in the rafters, on clothes, in your hair. It is soaked into the culture as thoroughly as it soaks into bread. You lie down on your bedding, and the air still carries that faint, oily tang. It's comforting now, oddly, like a lullaby written in the language of fish. And in your drowsy mind you think, perhaps Iceland itself smelled faintly of cod, from its kitchens to its churches, from the children's rosy cheeks to the shepherd's boots. Morning finds you following 2 men trudging up a slope, their boots crunching over frost-stiff moss. Each carries a staff, and behind them trail sheep that seem more opinionated than obedient. You soon realize you've stumbled into a different kind of battlefield, not one of swords, but of words. In 18th century Iceland, legal quarrels over grazing rights could stir up more heat than a midsummer bonfire. Mainstream historical fact: grazing disputes were central to rural Icelandic life. The highlands and lowlands alike had limited fertile ground, and boundaries weren't always marked with neat fences. Families relied on customary rights, recorded in law books or remembered in stories, to determine who could graze sheep where. Historians still argue whether these systems were more collaborative than competitive, or whether every boundary line was essentially a simmering lawsuit waiting to happen. At the edge of a stony ridge, the men stop. One points to a patch of scrubby grass where sheep nibble eagerly. "My father grazed here," he insists. The other shakes his head. "Your father grazed there, this is ours." Voices climb like the sheep scrambling on rocks. A third man arrives carrying a small wooden chest of documents, parchment records, earmark lists, old court rulings. They squat in the cold, arguing over words faded by time, each convinced the law is firmly in his favor. Quirky tidbit: Icelandic law included incredibly detailed codes for sheep ownership. Earmarks carved into sheep ears were registered like property deeds, and disputes over notches could escalate into full legal cases. You watch as one farmer pulls a ewe close, jabbing at her ear to prove which notch belongs to him. The ewe blinks, unimpressed, chewing grass with the air of someone tired of being Exhibit A. Joke number 1. Somewhere in Reykjavik, a judge probably muttered, "Another ear notch trial? I should have become a fisherman." The arguments could last hours, sometimes days. If unresolved, they escalated to the local thing. The assembly where neighbors gathered not just to solve disputes, but also to socialize, trade, and gossip. Imagine court combined with a county fair, complete with ale, sagas, and side-eye glances from across the field. You sense that half the fun wasn't in winning, but in telling the story later. You should have seen how red his face got when I proved him wrong. As you walk back down the slope, you pass a ruined turf wall, stones scattered and moss creeping over them. The guide explains it once marked a boundary, but storms and neglect erased the line. These ruined markers became flashpoints. Did the land revert to common use, or did families still claim it? Historians still argue whether Iceland's fragile soil could ever sustain the flocks demanded by ambitious farmers, or whether greed for more sheep accelerated the erosion still visible today. Inside a turf house that evening, you sit by the fire as elders retell famous quarrels. One tale describes two neighbors who fought for years over a single hillside, dragging each other to assemblies, bribing witnesses with fish, and finally agreeing only when an especially harsh winter killed half their flocks. By then, the grass had eroded into sand, proving the sheep had the last laugh. Joke number 2. Nothing ends a legal battle faster than the land itself, packing up and saying, "I'm done hosting your sheep." You imagine being a poor shepherd, caught in the middle. The sheep don't care about boundaries. They follow the grass. But the humans, with their pride and parchments, chase after them like lawyers in wool cloaks. The absurdity is thick, and yet livelihoods hung on those disputes. Wool and meat meant survival. Losing grazing meant hunger. Later, you're handed a cup of sour milk, while the men around you mutter about a new case brewing in the valley. They lean close, whispering which family will win, who might bribe the scribe, and whether the judge still holds a grudge from a past dispute. It feels less like law and more like theater, with sheep as the unwilling actors. Joke number 3. Somewhere out there, a sheep is probably drafting its own legal complaint. Objection: overgrazed and underappreciated. As the fire dims, the talk drifts to quieter tones. Despite the conflicts, the villagers know they must live side by side. Boundaries may blur, ears may notch, parchment may fade, but the island is small, the winter's long, and grudges eventually thaw, at least until the next sheep wanders too far uphill. You lie down in the smoky warmth, listening to muffled bleats outside. You realize the arguments aren't really about sheep alone. They're about dignity, memory, and the stubborn need to claim a piece of ground in a land where the ground itself resists being claimed. The next Sunday morning, the sound of a handbell carries through the chill air. You follow the villagers along a narrow path toward a small wooden church, its turf walls blending into the hillside. Inside, the air is heavy with smoke, wool, and the faint tang of cod oil clinging to coats. People murmur prayers, and then the priest climbs into the pulpit, his black robe stark against the pale walls. He begins to speak, not only of faith, but of food. Mainstream historical fact: the church played a strong role in regulating diets in 18th century Iceland. Certain days were marked for fasting, which meant abstaining from meat, milk, or butter, depending on the season and the priest's interpretation. Fish, however, often slid through as the acceptable loophole. Historians still argue whether these rules were more about genuine religious discipline or about making scarce resources stretch further. Either way, your dinner sometimes depended on the sermon. You sit quietly as the priest warns against indulgence. He points to butter, that golden treasure, and reminds the flock that hoarding or overeating it is sinful. A few farmers exchange guilty glances. You recall the rancid butter buried for weddings and wonder if they're silently negotiating with heaven. Joke number 1. In Iceland, it wasn't only your conscience that was salted, it was your butter too. A quirky tidbit. Some priests themselves were notorious for bending the rules. Records tell of clergymen who quietly sipped imported wine or sneaked meat during fasts, even while scolding their congregations. You glance up at the stern preacher and wonder how much dried fish he has tucked under his robe for later. Outside after service, families gather to eat their modest Sunday meal. The fare is simple: fish again, dairy again, but eaten with a sense of ritual. Children fidget while parents insist on prayers before eating. You realize that the church not only set rules, but also gave meals meaning. Breaking bread, or fish in this case, was a way of affirming community. Later in the week, you witness another kind of religious influence: the tithe system. Farmers brought butter, wool, or angelica stalks as offerings to the church. These goods supported priests, but also reinforced which foods were considered valuable. Imagine handing your pastor a stalk of celery and calling it holy payment. That's essentially what angelica became in Iceland. Joke number 2. Somewhere out there, a heavenly ledger is still keeping track of how many stalks of angelica equal one soul. You notice, too, how scripture seeped into cooking. Some households avoided certain combinations of foods on holy days, while others insisted on fish for specific festivals. The blending of old pagan customs with Christian fasting rules created a unique calendar of meals. Half sacred, half practical. Historians still argue whether Iceland's religious food practices were imposed strictly from outside or adapted creatively by locals who found ways to make the rules livable. Evenings in the priest's household look much the same as in the farms, except with more books on the shelves. You join them for a meal of skyr and dried fish. The priest blesses the food solemnly, but his children sneak extra butter when his head is bowed. You catch one smirking, and suddenly the rules feel less like iron chains and more like guidelines to be worked around. Joke number 3. Icelandic children must have invented the phrase, "Forgive me, Father, for I have buttered." As you drift into the quiet of night, the bells still echo faintly in your ears. The sermons, the fasting, the tithes, all of it folds into the rhythm of life, guiding when to feast and when to abstain. Yet beneath the rules, you sense a stubborn practicality. When fish is the only thing on the table, no priest alive can make it vanish. You lie back, wool blanket pulled to your chin, the smell of smoke and cod oil lingering. Faith, food, and flavor mingle in the air, inseparable. And as your eyes close, you realize that in Iceland, even sermons had an aftertaste. The wind shifts one morning, and down by the harbor you spot sails. Not the stubby fishing craft you've grown used to, but something taller, sleeker, foreign. A Danish merchant ship has arrived. The villagers hurry down, faces bright with anticipation. The cargo holds promise more than fish or wool. They promise exotic luxuries that crack open the gray sameness of Icelandic diet. Mainstream historical fact. During the 18th century, Iceland was bound under a Danish trade monopoly. Only licensed merchants could bring in goods, and they dictated the price. That meant cloves, pepper, sugar, and especially coffee reached the island rarely, and always expensively. Historians still argue whether the monopoly protected Iceland from market chaos, or simply starved it of opportunity. To the people gathering at the dock, though, none of that matters. What matters is the scent of spice drifting from the barrels. You watch as casks of rye flour are rolled ashore. Families whisper, "Bread!" Real bread, not dried fish. But the true treasures are smaller. Sacks of peppercorns, cloves like tiny nails, and precious packets of coffee beans. A quirky tidbit. When coffee first arrived in Iceland, it wasn't just a drink, it was practically a ritual object. Families would brew it sparingly, serving it black and bitter, sometimes stretching grounds with chicory or roasted dandelion root. Joke number 1. Imagine waking up after months of sour milk breakfast to find coffee. You'd swear heaven had docked in the harbor. In one house, a woman unwraps a paper twist of cloves, their sharp aroma filling the room. She drops a single clove into a pot of skyr for flavor. Just one, because wasting 2 would be extravagant beyond belief. Pepper, too, is used sparingly, sprinkled into broth like stardust. You taste a spoonful of fish soup, feel the faint warmth of pepper hit your tongue, and suddenly the entire meal seems transformed. You realize that spices here are less ingredients and more talismans against monotony. Joke number 2. If Iceland had Michelin stars in 1750, the criteria probably would have been adds 1 peppercorn, instant 3 stars. Imported fabrics also draw attention. Brightly dyed cloth in reds and blues, colors that leap against the landscape of browns and grays. Families trade wool, butter, and dried fish for these flashes of beauty. A girl proudly wraps herself in a crimson kerchief, her grin proof that luxury doesn't always come in edible form. Still, food is the heartbeat. Sugar appears in tiny cones, sometimes locked away until Christmas, when it sweetens a cake so rare that guests talk about it for months. Back in the village, people gather in a turf house where coffee brews on the hearth. The bitter steam curls upward, mingling with smoke. Cups are passed around, hands cupping them like holy relics. You sip, and though it is harsh, it is exhilarating. Your pulse quickens, your mind feels brighter. You see why the novelty of coffee was addictive. It wasn't just taste, it was stimulation, a new rhythm. Joke number 3. In a land where daylight itself takes 6 months vacation, coffee was the first real alarm clock. Historians still argue whether these imported luxuries changed Icelandic culture deeply or merely decorated it. Some suggest coffee houses later became hubs of discussion and dissent, while others insist the monopoly kept such shifts slow. What is undeniable is the thrill you see in the villagers' faces as they savor cloves and skyr, sugar on rye bread, and a swallow of coffee to cut through the endless dairy and fish routine. That night, you lie awake with a faint buzz in your veins from the coffee, listening to the wind whip the turf walls. You realize how strange it must have felt for Icelanders to taste the world beyond their island in such tiny bursts. Peppercorns, cloves, sugar grains, coffee sips. Each arrival was a reminder that, however remote the land, it was tethered by trade to a vast world. And yet, in the end, the feast always circled back to fish, butter, and sheep, spiced now and then with a hint of luxury. Morning finds you following 2 men trudging up a slope, their boots crunching over frost-stiff moss. Each carries a staff, and behind them trail sheep that seem more opinionated than obedient. You soon realize you've stumbled into a different kind of battlefield, not one of swords, but of words. In 18th century Iceland, legal quarrels over grazing rights could stir up more heat than a midsummer bonfire. Mainstream historical fact: grazing disputes were central to rural Icelandic life. The highlands and lowlands alike had limited fertile ground, and boundaries weren't always marked with neat fences. Families relied on customary rights, recorded in law books or remembered in stories, to determine who could graze sheep where. Historians still argue whether these systems were more collaborative than competitive, or whether every boundary line was essentially a simmering lawsuit waiting to happen. At the edge of a stony ridge, the men stop. One points to a patch of scrubby grass where sheep nibble eagerly. "My father grazed here," he insists. The other shakes his head. "Your father grazed there, this is ours." Voices climb like the sheep scrambling on rocks. A third man arrives carrying a small wooden chest of documents. Parchment records, earmark lists, old court rulings. They squat in the cold, arguing over words faded by time, each convinced the law is firmly in his favor. Quirky tidbit: Icelandic law included incredibly detailed codes for sheep ownership. Earmarks carved into sheep ears were registered like property deeds, and disputes over notches could escalate into full legal cases. You watch as one farmer pulls a ewe close, jabbing at her ear to prove which notch belongs to him. The ewe blinks, unimpressed, chewing grass with the air of someone tired of being Exhibit A. Joke number 1. Somewhere in Reykjavik, a judge probably muttered, "Another ear notch trial? I should have become a fisherman." The arguments could last hours, sometimes days. If unresolved, they escalated to the local thing. The assembly where neighbors gathered not just to solve disputes, but also to socialize, trade, and gossip. Imagine court combined with a county fair, complete with ale, sagas, and side-eye glances from across the field. You sense that half the fun wasn't in winning, but in telling the story later. You should have seen how red his face got when I proved him wrong. As you walk back down the slope, you pass a ruined turf wall, stones scattered and moss creeping over them. The guide explains it once marked a boundary, but storms and neglect erased the line. These ruined markers became flashpoints. Did the land revert to common use, or did families still claim it? Historians still argue whether Iceland's fragile soil could ever sustain the flocks demanded by ambitious farmers, or whether greed for more sheep accelerated the erosion still visible today. Inside a turf house that evening, you sit by the fire as elders retell famous quarrels. One tale describes two neighbors who fought for years over a single hillside, dragging each other to assemblies, bribing witnesses with fish, and finally agreeing only when an especially harsh winter killed half their flocks. By then, the grass had eroded into sand, proving the sheep had the last laugh. Joke number 2. Nothing ends a legal battle faster than the land itself, packing up and saying, "I'm done hosting your sheep." You imagine being a poor shepherd, caught in the middle. The sheep don't care about boundaries. They follow the grass. But the humans, with their pride and parchments, chase after them like lawyers in wool cloaks. The absurdity is thick, and yet livelihoods hung on those disputes. Wool and meat meant survival. Losing grazing meant hunger. Later, you're handed a cup of sour milk, while the men around you mutter about a new case brewing in the valley. They lean close, whispering which family will win, who might bribe the scribe, and whether the judge still holds a grudge from a past dispute. It feels less like law and more like theater, with sheep as the unwilling actors. Joke number 3. Somewhere out there, a sheep is probably drafting its own legal complaint. Objection: overgrazed and underappreciated. As the fire dims, the talk drifts to quieter tones. Despite the conflicts, the villagers know they must live side by side. Boundaries may blur, ears may notch, parchment may fade, but the island is small, the winter's long, and grudges eventually thaw. At least until the next sheep wanders too far uphill. You lie down in the smoky warmth, listening to muffled bleats outside. You realize the arguments aren't really about sheep alone. They're about dignity, memory, and the stubborn need to claim a piece of ground in a land where the ground itself resists being claimed. The fire burns low, and outside the turf walls the wind is little more than a tired sigh. Tonight the stew pot has been set aside. The cod oil lamps flicker faintly and conversation drifts in soft murmurs. You close your eyes and let the sounds and smells of 18th century Iceland settle over you one last time. Fish drying in the wind, butter being scraped thin, angelica stalks bundled under rafters, and the eternal slightly ridiculous bleating of sheep, all of it folds into a single memory, stubborn and enduring. Mainstream historical fact: Iceland's diet during this period, bound by scarcity and shaped by ingenuity, revolved around dried fish, dairy, and sheep, supplemented by imports through Danish trade. Historians still argue whether this monotony dulled cultural development or forged a resilience that defined the national character. What you've seen suggests both: boredom and brilliance, survival and identity hand-stitched together like a wool mitten. A quirky tidbit: long after the 18th century, Icelanders continued to serve some of these same foods. Hakarl at festivals, skyer at breakfast, dried fish as snack, even as global trade made luxuries common. What began as necessity hardened into tradition, so much so that visitors today still gag politely at shark cubes while locals smile knowingly. Joke number 1, survival food has a funny way of becoming heritage cuisine once enough time passes. You picture the markets with their wool socks and salted herring, the children chewing sour berries, the priests warning about butter, the neighbors bickering over ear notches and sheep. All these tiny fragments of daily life are echoes that stitched Iceland's cultural quilt. The taste of fish and the weight of wool were more than survival, they were identity. Now, as the night deepens, the villagers around you fade into shadows, their voices softer, their arguments about sheep grazing reduced to little more than whispers. You imagine them carrying these disputes into their dreams, only to wake and begin again. Joke number 2. Somewhere in Iceland, even the sheep probably dreamed about humans arguing. The lamp burns lower, and the air fills with the faint tang of smoke, seaweed, and wool. You breathe slowly, steady, letting it all linger. Joke number 3. When future historians argue about this time, they might not fight over land or fish. They'll fight over who had the worst breath after cod liver oil. Your body sinks into the wool bedding, and you understand. Iceland's stubborn tastes, its endless sheep debates, its odd love for rancid butter and sour whey, they all wove together a culture that endured, stubborn as the land itself. The island tested its people, and they answered with fish, with wool, with laughter, with resilience. And now, as your eyes grow heavy, those echoes become lullabies. The fish racks creak softly in the wind, the sheep shuffle in the dark hills, and a faint sweetness of angelica drifts through the air. The argument's quiet, the food cools, the night carries you toward sleep, and so, with the last echoes of wool and fish fading, you can let the story slip gently into the background. The harsh winds of Iceland soften now, no longer biting your cheeks but brushing like cool silk over your skin. The sea is distant, the gulls have gone quiet, and the smoke from turf fires curls lazily upward, becoming less a smell than a memory. You are safe here, wrapped in wool, with no need to argue about grazing rights or to chew another stubborn strip of dried cod. Each detail, the sour tang of whey, the sharp bite of Arctic thyme, the bitter courage of fermented shark, becomes gentler as you drift. They are no longer flavors, but fading notes in a lullaby. The voices of neighbors debating over sheep melt into a steady murmur, like the rise and fall of waves against the shore. The flicker of lamps grows slower, dimmer, until it is only a warm blur behind your eyelids. You let your breath deepen. You let your shoulders grow heavy. Time itself slows to match the rhythm of your heart. In the distance, the island rests. Its hills lie still beneath the stars, its rivers frozen into silver threads, its sheep curled quietly in their folds. The arguments and the chores can wait until morning. For now, there is nothing to resolve, nothing to prepare, nothing to count. Only stillness. And as you drift, you carry with you the resilience of those Icelanders, the strength to weather storms, the humor to laugh at hardship, the patience to endure monotony. Their story becomes your blanket, their endurance your quiet dream. The world softens and sleep comes easily.